He's just a useless husband, my wife told the court. She didn't say it with anger or emotion. She said it as if she were reading a conclusion she'd reached years ago. I stayed silent. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked past my wife and focused on her attorney. Her eyes narrowed, not with malice, but with a sharp, piercing curiosity. "Counselor," the judge asked, her voice cutting through the room, "are you certain you understand exactly who Mr. Hartwell is and what he actually does for a living?" Lydia stiffened. Her attorney hesitated. And for the first time that morning, the polished confidence of Lydia Hartwell began to crack. The clock above the bench read 9:14 a.m. Courtroom 3B was smaller than people imagine. No dramatic echoes, no packed galleries. Just worn wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and the faint, sterile smell of paper and disinfectant. I sat at the respondent's table with my palms resting flat against the surface. I learned long ago that clenched fists invite interpretation. Still hands do not. My name is Ethan Cole Hartwell. I am 52 years old. I've been married to Lydia for 26 years. And until 3 weeks before this hearing, no one had ever suggested, in writing or otherwise, that I was incapable of managing my own life. Lydia stood a few feet away in her sympathetic uniform, a navy blazer, neutral makeup, and the pearl necklace she wore whenever she wanted to look composed yet vulnerable. She had practiced this version of herself. Her attorney, Trent Walden, had just finished painting a picture of a saintly wife carrying the financial and emotional weight of a household while her husband sat by, withdrawn and disengaged. Then Lydia delivered her blow. He's just a useless husband. He doesn't understand finances. He never has. She didn't look at me. I didn't react. Reacting would have only served her narrative. Lydia always mistook my silence for emptiness and my restraint for absence. That misunderstanding was the foundation of her undoing. Judge Marlene Sykes leaned back. She was in her mid-60s with silver hair and reading glasses balanced low on her nose. She had the calm presence of someone who had heard thousands of stories and knew exactly how to spot the seams where they didn't hold. "Counselor," she said evenly to Trent, "are you confident in your understanding of Mr. Hartwell's professional background?" "Yes, Your Honor," Trent blinked. "He works in operations, risk management, I believe." "And you're certain that's the full picture?" The silence that followed was long enough for everyone in the room to feel the shift. Lydia turned toward me, her expression tightening. I hadn't planned for this moment to arrive so early, but Judge Sykes had a habit of asking direct questions the moment things stopped adding up. 3 weeks earlier, Lydia had filed an emergency petition for a financial conservatorship over me. She claimed I was unable to recognize exploitation and was emotionally impaired. Within 48 hours, my accounts were frozen, and my employer placed me on administrative leave. The word incompetent hadn't been spoken yet, but it was there, hovering in the air. I didn't protest. I didn't argue. I've spent my life in compliance and internal risk analysis. It's quiet, uncelebrated at work. I don't chase headlines. I support investigations. I review systems, document inconsistencies, and advise companies when something feels off. Lydia had always dismissed it as paper shuffling. When my mother, June, suffered a stroke 8 months ago, Lydia offered to handle the logistics. "It'll take the pressure off you," she'd said. I let her. June trusted Lydia, or perhaps she just trusted the marriage. Either way, papers were signed during moments of fatigue. Accounts were accessed for convenience. Then June died. 3 weeks after the funeral, the petition arrived. Listening to my wife call me useless, I felt a strange clarity. Lydia wasn't improvising. This was a plan that required me to be exactly who she believed I was: quiet, unobservant, and disengaged. She didn't realize that my silence never meant I wasn't paying attention. Judge Sykes tapped her pen. "Mr. Hartwell, you've remained silent so far. Is that intentional?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" I met her gaze. "Because this petition depends on assumptions, and assumptions tend to collapse the moment facts are introduced." The courtroom went still. Lydia inhaled sharply. Judge Sykes studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Ms. Mercer, proceed." My attorney, Dana Mercer rose slowly. For the first time since this started, Lydia looked truly uncertain. The first time Lydia called me useless wasn't in court. It was years ago at our kitchen table, shortly after our son left for college. She was sorting mail with quick, irritated movements. "What's your plan, Ethan?" she'd asked. "For your career? For us? You just float." I remember nodding. I thought restraint was maturity. I thought silence kept arguments from becoming scars. I didn't realize that silence could be repurposed into evidence against me. Over time, Lydia took over everything. She moved savings, changed insurance contacts, and told the kids, "Ask me about money. Dad doesn't like dealing with that stuff." I let it go to avoid the fight. When my mother began to fade, Lydia stepped in with a confidence that felt reassuring. "Let me handle the boring parts," she told me. June trusted her. But then Lydia started simplifying June's accounts. "Just housekeeping," she'd wave off. After the funeral, while I was grieving, the petition arrived by courier. Financial incapacity. Emergency conservatorship. My own kids stopped calling. My daughter sent a text. "Mom says you need help." That night, I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I opened my laptop and started where I always start. Records. I pulled bank statements and requested transaction histories. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves to the patient. It took a full day to see the alignment. Small withdrawals, consulting fees, and transfers, all just under reporting thresholds, clustered around the dates Lydia had visited my mother alone. I built a spreadsheet. I cross-referenced every cent. By the end of the week, I had identified tens of thousands of dollars in missing funds. When I finally asked Lydia about one of the transactions, carefully, neutrally, she just smiled. It was the smile of someone who thought they had already won. Gemini said, "Don't worry about it," she'd said. "I've got it under control." That was the moment something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger or betrayal. It was recognition. Lydia didn't see herself as a thief. She saw herself as correcting an imbalance. She believed she deserved control because she believed she had carried us for years, and she truly believed I would never notice. That belief was the most dangerous thing she brought into court. Silence, when mistaken for absence, becomes a liability. Lydia had built her entire case on the assumption that I simply wasn't there. I didn't go back to my mother's house immediately. For days after the petition arrived, I stayed in our home, moving through rooms that suddenly felt temporary. Lydia was careful during that time. Not kind, but careful. She spoke slowly, as if volume alone might shatter me. She reminded me of appointments I didn't have and offered to handle things I hadn't asked her to touch. She was building a record. So I waited. When I finally drove to June's house, it was a gray Thursday morning. Oak Park was quiet, the neighborhood unchanged in ways that felt almost accusatory. I sat in the driveway, hands resting on the steering wheel. The house didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a life paused mid-sentence. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and old books, the June smell. I went straight to the spare bedroom, where she kept her records in a 4-drawer filing cabinet. Utilities, medical, banking, taxes. After my father died, she'd told me, "If something happens to me, you'll know where to look." I opened every drawer. At first, everything looked fine, but after an hour of sorting, the patterns began to fray. Envelopes resealed, statements out of sequence, gaps where originals should have been. Then, I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden. It sat in a folder marked legal. June's signature was there, real but uneven, matching the shaky weeks after her stroke. The language was dangerously broad, granting authority over her finances without limitation. But it was the timing that caught my eye. The document was signed on a day her neurologist had noted increased confusion. Not incompetence, just vulnerability. Enough to make consent questionable. Enough to make pressure effective. I photographed it and kept searching. The journal was tucked between 2 photo albums in the hall closet, a brown leather notebook, worn soft at the edges. June's first entry was dated 15 months before her death. Lydia called today. Said she wanted to help more. Sounded sincere. I want to believe it. The entry started short, mostly notes about fatigue. Then the tone shifted. Foggy day. Lydia had papers. Said they were to help her talk to the bank. I signed. Shouldn't have. Too tired to argue. 2 weeks later, better day. Looked at papers. Power of attorney. I didn't mean to give that. Embarrassed. Don't want to trouble Ethan. My chest tightened. The last entry was addressed to me. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time. I wasn't crying. I was just breathing. When I left, I took copies of everything. Originals stayed where they were. Evidence matters more when it hasn't been disturbed. That afternoon, I called Dana Mercer. She listened the way investigators do, without interrupting. This isn't about notary fraud, she said when I finished. It's about exploitation during vulnerability. That's worse. I want the truth to surface on its own, I told her, without me forcing it. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then we wait, and we prepare. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived deliberately within Lydia's expectations. I didn't confront her. I answered her attorney's questions during the deposition with minimal detail. Lydia watched via video link, and I saw her relax. She mistook my restraint for surrender. Meanwhile, Dana was working. She requested bank records through the proper channels and quietly alerted Adult Protective Services, triggering an independent inquiry. Truth carries more weight when it doesn't rely on just one voice. In court the next morning, Courtroom 3B felt different after the judge's question. It felt alert. Judge Sykes adjusted her glasses and looked at Dana. Ms. Mercer, you may proceed. Dana stood slowly. Your Honor, she began. This petition is built on the assertion that Mr. Hartwell lacks the capacity to recognize financial exploitation. What we intend to show is that the opposite is true, and that the exploitation occurred specifically because someone believed he wouldn't notice. She pulled up the bank records on the monitor. A simple timeline, dates on the left, transactions on the right, withdrawals and transfers labeled as administrative support and consulting. These transactions, Dana said, occurred over a 10-month period. Each coincides with a visit by Ms. Hartwell to June Cole's residence. Not to medical appointments, to the residence. Trent Walden half rose from his seat. Objection. Overruled, Judge Sykes said calmly. Proceed. Next, Dana addressed the power of attorney. She framed it clinically. This document was executed when Ms. Cole's neurologist documented reduced executive functioning. In Illinois, consent obtained during vulnerability requires scrutiny. Lydia crossed her arms tightly. Dana moved to the next slide. After gaining access, we see a marked change in transaction behavior. Prior to this, Ms. Cole's spending was consistent for a decade. Afterward, we see discretionary withdrawals with no invoices and no documentation. Trent objected again, but his voice lacked confidence. Judge Sykes overruled him without even looking up. Your Honor, Dana said, context is important. She turned to me. Mr. Hartwell, can you explain your professional role for the last 20 years? I stood. I work in internal compliance and risk analysis. I help organizations identify irregular financial behavior and systemic weaknesses. Have you testified in court? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. A few times when companies needed an expert to explain complex findings. Judge Sykes nodded, then turned back to Lydia's attorney. Counselor, she said, her voice dropping an octave, was this background included in your assessment of Mr. Hartwell's incapacity? Was this background included in your assessment of Mr. Hartwell's capacity? Trent Walden hesitated, the confidence draining from his posture. We understood his role to be limited. That, Judge Sykes replied evenly, appears to have been an assumption. Lydia stood up abruptly. He doesn't like attention, she snapped, her voice sharp enough to echo. He hides behind spreadsheets. That doesn't make him competent. Judge Sykes raised a hand. Ms. Hartwell, sit down. Lydia didn't argue, but her jaw remained clenched. Dana Mercer resumed her presentation. She didn't introduce the journal yet. Instead, she presented a summary from Adult Protective Services, APS. APS had been notified, a preliminary review had begun, and banks had flagged irregularities independently. This court, Dana said, was asked to intervene because Ms. Hartwell claimed her husband couldn't recognize exploitation. Yet multiple institutions did exactly that without any prompting from him. The judge's expression shifted. "Ms. Mercer," she said slowly, "are you suggesting that this petition itself triggered a broader review?" "Yes, Your Honor. And that review is ongoing." Silence settled over the room, heavier than before. Judge Sykes folded her hands and turned to Lydia. "Ms. Hartwell, you requested emergency authority over your husband's finances. Based on what I've heard today, that request appears premature." Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it. "I am denying the petition," Judge Sykes continued, with prejudice. She paused, and given the evidence presented and the independent inquiries now underway, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney for further review." The words landed softly, but they landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. Lydia's shoulders dropped, not in shame, but in calculation. She had lost control of the timeline. Judge Sykes looked at me once more. "Mr. Hartwell, you were right to remain silent." I nodded once. As the gavel struck, I felt no surge of triumph, only a sense of alignment. Something that had been skewed for a long time was finally being straightened out. Outside the courtroom, Dana leaned toward me. "This part is over," she said quietly. "The next part won't be." I knew that. When systems begin to move, they rarely stop at the first truth they uncover. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a final thud. The air carried the sharp edge of early spring. Dana walked beside me toward the parking lot. "The petition is denied, but that's not the end of this." "I know," I replied. What surprised me was how little relief I felt. The denial had lifted the immediate threat, but it hadn't restored what Lydia had taken. My accounts were still under review. My employer was still cautious, and my children were still caught between two versions of the same story. Within 48 hours, the audit expanded. There are no sirens, just the methodical work of banks doing what they are trained to do when APS opens an inquiry. They widened the scope. June's accounts were examined alongside every joint account Lydia had ever touched. Transaction histories were requested going back years. Dana called me that night. "APS is formally involved now. They aren't accusing, they're documenting. That matters." "Does Lydia know?" I asked. "Not yet," Dana said. "But she will." Lydia didn't come home that evening. Instead, she sent a text. "We need to talk. You embarrassed me today." I didn't respond. The next morning, my phone rang before 8 o'clock. It was Ryan. His voice was tight, the way people sound when they're trying not to choose sides. "Mom says the judge overreacted. She says you set this up." I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "What do you think?" He paused. "I don't know," he admitted. "She's always handled things. You've always stayed out of it. That's not the same as not paying attention, Ryan." He exhaled. "Hannah's upset." "She hasn't called," I said. "She's scared. Mom told her to stay out of it." I felt a pang in my chest. Tell her she doesn't have to choose. She just has to tell the truth, to herself, if no one else. Later that afternoon, Dana forwarded an email from a bank compliance officer. Multiple transactions have been flagged as inconsistent. Several payments routed through a third-party consulting entity raised red flags. A request for information had been sent to the account holder, Lydia. "She'll panic," Dana told me. "That's when mistakes happen." I didn't want her to panic. Panic is unpredictable. I wanted her to explain. Explanations leave trails. 2 days later, an APS caseworker named Elaine Morris called me. She asked about June's habits and her independence before the stroke. I answered truthfully and carefully. I didn't accuse. I described facts, dates, and observations. Lydia came home late that night, dropping her purse on the table with a bang. "They're questioning me," she snapped. "Banks, some social worker. This is your fault." I looked at her. She seemed smaller, compressed by the weight of scrutiny. "This is the result of your petition, Lydia. You asked for oversight. I asked to protect the family. By declaring me incompetent," I replied. Her eyes flashed. "You are incompetent, Ethan. You don't understand how things work." I almost smiled. "Tell them that." She stared at me, then turned away. The next week was a blur of interviews and clarifications. Ryan visited briefly, sitting on the edge of the couch. She won't answer questions directly. She keeps saying people are twisting things. Do you believe her? He hesitated. I don't know what to believe. That's honest, I said. Hannah called 2 nights later, her voice shaking. Dad, I think I messed up. You didn't, I said immediately. Whatever it is. She told me she'd seen Lydia wearing June's earrings months ago, the family jewelry. Lydia had told her June gave them to her as a gift. Hannah hadn't questioned it then, but now she wasn't sure. I was afraid Mom would be mad if I said anything. You can tell APS, I said gently. You don't have to accuse. Just tell them what you saw. Will it ruin everything? I thought of June's journal, of her quiet, careful preparation. No, I said. It clarifies things. The audit findings arrived in pieces, each one aligning with the last. Transfers to third parties, vague justifications, and documentation created after the fact. Then Dana called with a major update. They identified the intermediary, a woman named Janelle Pierce. She's not licensed or bonded, and investigators have contacted her. Did she respond? Yes, Dana said. With counsel. That meant Janelle wasn't acting impulsively. This was going to unfold the way real cases do, slowly, deliberately, with consequences measured in months. Ethan, Dana said, be prepared. This will take time. Relationships won't just snap back. Some things will never return to the way they were. I looked around the kitchen, the same table where Lydia had called me useless, the same quiet corners where her assumptions had hardened into truth. I'm not looking for everything to go back to the way it was, I said. I'm just looking for things to be honest. That's usually harder, Dana replied. When I hung up, I sat alone with that thought. Honesty doesn't rush, it accumulates. And once it takes hold, it doesn't just disappear because someone finds it inconvenient. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that pretends to be ordinary until you answer the phone. They've formally contacted Janelle Pierce, Dana told me. She has counsel present. She hasn't confessed to anything yet, but she's cooperating. I sat at the dining table, my laptop closed, and the house quiet in that heavy way it had recently learned to be. What does that mean exactly? I'm not looking for everything to go back to the way it was, I said. I'm just looking for things to be honest. That's usually harder, Dana replied. When I hung up, I sat alone with that thought. Honesty doesn't rush, it accumulates. And once it takes hold, it doesn't just disappear because someone finds it inconvenient. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that pretends to be ordinary until you answer the phone. They've formally contacted Janelle Pierce, Dana told me. She has counsel present. She hasn't confessed to anything yet, but she's cooperating. I sat at the dining table, my laptop closed, and the house quiet in that heavy way it had recently learned to be. What does that mean exactly? It means she's answering narrowly, Dana explained. She's providing records when compelled, but no speeches, no excuses. This is how people protect themselves when they realize the ground has shifted. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. It was consistent with everything I'd seen so far. People who think they're in control tend to improvise. People who know they're exposed follow procedures. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded in small, methodical steps. APS completed its initial assessment and referred the matter to the county. Bank compliance units issued follow-up requests. Subpoenas were drafted, not dramatic, just precise. Every request pulled another thread. Lydia tried to regain control by appearing cooperative. She attended interviews and answered emails promptly. She framed every transfer as a misunderstanding and every payment as an administrative necessity. She leaned heavily on the narrative that June had wanted things handled quietly and that I had never taken an interest. The investigators listened. Then they compared her notes to the facts. The pattern didn't change, but Lydia's tone did. She stopped calling me incompetent and started calling me manipulative. She told Ryan I was weaponizing my job and told Hannah I was letting outsiders tear the family apart. Each version of her story contradicted the last, and each conversation left more residue. Ryan withdrew. He didn't defend her anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to confront her either. When he visited, he spoke in fragments, questions without conclusions. I let him. Loyalty isn't something you can pull apart quickly without doing permanent damage. Hannah, however, started talking. It wasn't easy, but she began to describe moments she hadn't thought mattered. Her mother asking her to run vague errands to the bank, instructions to stay out of grown-up stuff. Separately, these were nothing. Together, they sketched intent. Let them assemble the picture, Dana cautioned me. Your job is to remain consistent. That consistency mattered when the district attorney's office finally reached out. Assistant State's Attorney Renee Alvarez requested a meeting. No accusations, just a conversation. Dana and I met her in a modest conference room downtown. Renee didn't waste time. We're looking at potential charges related to financial exploitation of an elderly adult, possibly fraud and forgery, depending on how certain documents were used. I asked the only question that mattered to me. What happens next? Evidence review, she replied. Witness cooperation. If charges are filed, we'll offer a plea. If it's not accepted, we proceed to trial. This won't be quick. I'm not in a hurry, I said. That night, Lydia finally confronted me. She waited until the house was still, until the kids were gone, and it felt safe to try and control the narrative one last time. You did this, she said, standing across from me in the living room. You could have stopped this at any point. I looked at her, not with anger or defensiveness, but with a tired kind of peace. I didn't start it, I said, and I can't stop what I didn't create. She let out a brittle laugh. You always hide behind your procedures and systems. You act like you're above all this. I'm not above it, I replied. I'm inside it. Her expression shifted, not to fear, but to a final calculation. They won't put me in prison, she said. Not for this. I didn't answer. 2 weeks later, Lydia was charged. The indictment listed counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraudulent documentation. She wasn't arrested in a dramatic sweep. She was notified through counsel and surrendered voluntarily. It was procedural, predictable, and a matter of public record, but it was not a spectacle. Trent Walden withdrew as her attorney the very next day. The plea negotiations took months. Lydia rejected the first offer, then the second. She insisted on explanations that the evidence flatly contradicted. She blamed stress, she blamed our marriage, and she blamed me. Finally, the paper trail closed the remaining exits, the transfers, the intermediary, the power of attorney executed during a documented period of vulnerability. There were no inconsistencies left for her to reconcile. She accepted a plea to a Class 2 felony. Her sentence reflected her lack of prior convictions, a suspended prison sentence contingent on compliance, 5 years of probation, and full restitution with interest. Most importantly, she received a permanent prohibition from ever acting as a fiduciary or managing another person's assets again. To pay the restitution, Lydia was forced to liquidate her own assets, including a property she had quietly purchased the year before under a trust name I was never supposed to find. I wasn't in the room when the judge accepted the plea. Dana called me afterward. It's done, she said. I sat at the kitchen table and let that sink in. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a weight redistribution, like something heavy had finally been placed where it belonged. The consequences rippled outward. My employer eventually reinstated me, but only after people understood why probationary period of monitoring and additional disclosures. I accepted it without complaint. Some systems forgive slowly, and I, of all Ryan, took longer. He oscillated between anger and grief, not always sure which belonged where. We talked, but we didn't resolve everything. That wasn't the point. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't follow a verdict. Hannah began therapy and eventually asked if I'd attend a session with her. I did. Months later, Lydia sent a letter through her attorney. It was shorter this time. Still no apology, just regret reshaped into self-defense. I didn't respond. Some conversations don't require closure. They require distance. One evening, after the house had grown quiet again, I opened June's journal and read the last entry once more. If you're reading this, she'd written, it means you didn't look away. I closed the book. The systems had spoken. Now, it was my turn to live with what they'd said. The first time I woke up and realized the case was truly over, nothing felt different. There was no rush of relief or surge of triumph, just a deep, settling quiet. It was early, before 6 a.m. The house was still, with the kind of stillness that used to make me uneasy. But as I lay there listening to it, I realized that for the first time in over a year, the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to be broken. The plea had been entered 3 weeks prior. The paperwork was finalized, the restitution schedules were approved, and the probation terms were set. Lydia was no longer fighting. Not because she had accepted responsibility, but because there were no moves left that wouldn't make things worse. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely announces itself. It settles in like the weather. The financial fallout was slower. Lawyers had to be paid, and audits carried high price. Even with restitution, stolen money doesn't return all at once. I sold my mother's house in Oak Park in late autumn. I didn't want to, but it made sense. Holding on to it would have meant clinging to something that had already served its purpose. On the final day before the closing, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. The house echoed, not with ghosts, just with absence. I stood in the kitchen where June had once balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning, always with 2 sugars in her coffee and a small notebook open beside her. I took her journal from my bag and placed it on the counter. I didn't look away. I said quietly, to no one in particular. Then I walked out and closed the door. Work resumed gradually. My employer reinstated me with conditions: additional oversight, periodic disclosures, and a quiet reminder that trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild, even when you aren't the one who caused the fracture. I accepted it without resentment. Systems don't run on emotion, they run on consistency, and I knew how to be consistent. Ryan didn't come around right away. For months, our conversation stayed careful and scripted. He was polite, he asked about work, and he avoided talking about his mother. I didn't push. Loyalty doesn't vanish just because facts arrive. It has to unwind on its own. The turning point came unexpectedly. He called one evening to ask if I still had June's old recipe box. "I found something," he said. He came over that weekend and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. A bank notice dated years ago, addressed to June but forwarded to Lydia's email. "I found it in Mom's old files," Ryan said quietly. "She never mentioned it. I don't know why." I looked at him, noticing how his hands shook just slightly as he held the paper. "It's okay," I said. "You don't have to fix this." "I know," he replied. "I just needed you to know. I see it now." That was enough. Hannah's healing looked different. Therapy helped, and distance helped even more. She didn't excuse Lydia, but she didn't sever her connection to her mother completely, either. She learned slowly that loving someone doesn't require defending their choices. Watching her learn, that taught me something, too. Lydia never apologized. She complied. She attended the mandated sessions, she paid the restitution, and she followed the terms of her probation. But remorse, real remorse, requires looking inward, and Lydia had spent too long outsourcing that work. I stopped expecting it. Months later, I received one final letter, not from Lydia, but from the court clerk. It was the confirmation that restitution was complete and June's estate was officially closed. That chapter was finally sealed. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with nothing spread out in front of me. No documents, no timelines, no spreadsheets. Just a cup of coffee and the quiet I'd once mistaken for emptiness. I thought about the word useless, how easily it had been said, and how confidently it had been believed. Silence doesn't mean ignorance. Calm doesn't mean weakness. And being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it, too. Lydia thought my quiet made me invisible. She thought my restraint meant disengagement. She thought paper was something you could rearrange without consequence. She forgot that paper remembers. If you're still here, thank you for listening, for staying with this story through its uncomfortable parts. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly erased by someone who thought you wouldn't notice, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. These stories don't exist in isolation. They live in the spaces where we recognize ourselves. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories about dignity and the long arc of quiet justice, please subscribe. There are more ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.